Okay, all right. Thanks for coming. Today we're in a cool one. I don't know if that's spelled right, but we are going to talk about Melchizedek. We are going to talk about Melchizedek. There we go. All right, what do you know about Melchizedek? Where do you find it? Yes, Genesis. Shadows in Genesis. What do we mean by that? We mean that this book is a novel, right? It's a novel. We need to learn to read it as a novel. Hebrews, right out of Hebrews. Melchizedek's big in Hebrews. The author of that, is the one who calls them shadows. Those are shadows of the reality. They're not the reality. He isn't saying they're not true, but they're not the point. They were written on purpose to lead us somewhere. Okay, that's a novel. That's how you describe a novel. I used to think of the Bible as just, read one book at a time and everything you need to know is in that book. And I didn't read it as a novel. And so I missed tons of things. And I don't want to make that mistake. It's a novel, or else they're not shadows. If they're shadows going somewhere, they're intentional stories that are put there right at the beginning to say, here's a riddle, here's where we're headed, right? So we're not looking at all of them. We could literally look at everything as a shadow. But we've looked at Adam, we looked at Noah, we looked at Abraham. Now we're looking at Melchizedek, and then we're going to look at Joseph, and then hopefully, we could pick five. We could do it forever, really. But I want to give you the idea, right? So this one's a cool one. Melchizedek's cool. We find him in chapter 14 of Genesis. So again, page-wise, in my Bible, it's not very many pages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 pages into this big book, I'm already getting introduced to this guy named Melchizedek, right? He's there on purpose, and the shocking thing is we have 2 verses. That's it, 2 verses. And yet, he turns into this crazy character into the New Testament through the Jewish history, right? Because the Jews totally recognize him as a shadow. The Jews in the Old Testament recognize him as a riddle. And they don't know what to do with him. So they ponder about it. The rabbis write about Melchizedek. Eventually he ends up in one psalm that David writes. So he's there in Abraham. Abraham, timeline, Abraham, 400 years roughly to Moses. And then you have 400 years to David, maybe-ish. So 800 years later, the Jews are still pondering Melchizedek, and David writes Psalm 110, and that the author in Hebrews takes Psalm 110 and the Genesis bit and blows it up into this huge thing. But he shows up 800 years later in a psalm, not out of nowhere. The Jews are speculating about this guy. Why are they speculating? What's the riddle? So we're going to figure that out, okay? So let me tell you the whole story, and you can read it in Genesis 14, and then the Melchizedek bit is 18, right? Verse 18. Yeah. All right, so here's the basic storyline. God calls Abraham. And says, follow me. Abraham takes Lot with him when he leaves his father's household, and Lot goes with him as a helper. Abraham is got flocks. He's going to have more flocks, and he's his nephew. He's going to help him, right? So Lot travels with him. Eventually, God keeps blessing Abraham, and he gets more and more stuff, but he also blesses the people in Abraham's life, Lot being one of them. And he begins to bless Lot, and Lot gets stuff. Now all of a sudden, they just have way too much herds to stay together, right? Their herdsmen have to take their sheep farther and farther away because there's so many of them. They have so much stuff. So Abraham comes to Lot and says, listen, like God is clearly on our side. Why don't you look out? He isn't saying we're not going to be friends. He isn't saying any of that. He's just saying, we need more land than this, right? We need more land. Why don't you look out over the whole horizon and you take whatever you want, and I'll go the other way, and we're both going to be in Canaan. They're a day's walk away from each other. It's not far, but it's far enough that they can keep flourishing. They can keep growing without worrying about numbers. Lot goes towards Sodom, which would have been pastures. He picked the greenest areas, right? He went that way, and Abraham said, "Fine, I'll go that way." So they split. And so if we had a map, something like this, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. This is Galilee. So Sodom and Gomorrah are down here somewhere. This is about here. So Lot's about here. Abraham's going to be down here somewhere, right? And Salem or Jerusalem will be here, right? Salem at this point in time. So what happens is, in this story, is that kings from up here, that's where the giants live, as a side note. So the kings from up here come down raiding, right? They come to raid, and they pillage all these areas. And they come here and they pillage, and they take everyone captive, right? They take slaves. So these kings come down and capture Lot, his whole family, and other towns and other kings and all the people and all the stuff, and they go running away. A servant gets away, goes and tells Abraham. Abraham's like, whoa, can't let that happen. So Abraham's going to come to the rescue. Abraham tries to rally some more kings. He doesn't really. He goes, 300 and some people, I forget. But Abraham goes on a rescue thing. They go up here, they do battle. He defeats those kings and rescues all the people and all the stuff. Okay? And now they're on their way back. They're on their way back. With all the people and all the stuff, they're on their way back. And these kings who didn't go help, but nonetheless got captured and stuff captured, and even if they didn't, they're coming out to see this great guy who with 300 and so armies went and defeated like 3 kings and all their armies together. They're going to go meet him. Like, okay, this guy's pretty cool, right? So these kings come out, and with them is Melchizedek. Melchizedek, at this point in time, is king of Salem. It'll say that right in the text. And they're coming out to meet a victorious Abraham who has all the stuff. That's the story. That's the setting. Okay? All right. So here's all we know. Listen to this. Starting in 16, he recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and other people. After Abraham returned from defeating these people, the kings allied with him. The king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shavah. That's the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "With raised hand I have sworn an oath to Yahweh, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abraham rich.' I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me. To Ener, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them have their share. That's it. It's the whole story. He's a nobody. Nothing happens. That's it. He's mentioned in a list of people. He's not alone. He's not like the other people in the story are nothing. They don't speculate about them at all. What's happening? What's happening? So something that's important to the story, is that the king of Salem, Melchizedek, it doesn't say that anything got taken from Jerusalem, from Salem. Nothing got taken in the first place. No one got captured, nothing got taken. The other king who went out with him, he did get stuff taken, and he says to Abraham, listen, we're happy to have the people back. Like, we just thought we lost all our families. We're happy to have our families back, you get to keep all the stuff. Abraham's like, no, I don't want your stuff. You can have it all back. So he returns the stuff to one king, to Melchizedek, who didn't lose anything at all. Before he gives the stuff back to that king, he first gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything. Tenth of everything. So a tenth goes to Melchizedek, who didn't lose anything. So he's super important, obviously. He's an important king in this area at that time. Like, I would venture to say Jerusalem is a key location, right? It's a key location. It's up on a hill. It overlooks the king, all these valleys. It's strategic. He's probably a very strong king. It's probably why these other kings didn't attack it. Like, they looked at the weaker spots. We can get those. Let's take those. There's plenty of stuff. We don't want to do a real battle. We're going to avoid Salem, which is interesting because that's right. Remember, when Abraham takes Isaac to sacrifice him, where does he go? Right into the middle of Salem. Like he isn't going out in the middle of nowhere. He's going to the Dome of the Rock, which is literally on the hill in downtown Salem. Like, right in public. It's shocking. I can't believe I missed that. But here we are. So, it's a big place. So what's the riddle? For the Jews, the riddle is this. Who's writing this story? Moses is writing this story, right? Timeline. Does he have the law already? Yes, he does. So he's been to Mount Sinai. A-I. Is that right? He's been to Sinai. He has the law. He has the law. Most of the law isn't don't do this, do this. Most of the law is how to relate to God. The priesthood, the clothes, clean and unclean laws, tithing, all this stuff, right? So they get the whole law. They're at Sinai, they go, they travel, they try to get into the promised land. Moses doesn't have time for writing yet, right? They get to the promised land, they can't get in, they won't go in, and now they have 40 years to wander. Moses has all the time in the world to write Genesis after. That's 40 years, right? He can write. They have the law. He gets this story as part of the law. Genesis is part of the law. The law is the Torah, the 5 books, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. That's called the law. They would never call the 10 Commandments the law. Like that would be foreign to a Jew. The books of Moses is the Torah, the law. They have the law. They know about tithing. They know about... How do you know tithing?
T-H-E.
What?
T-H-E.
E? So they know what a tithe is, and a tithe is 10%. And they know who gets the 10% under the law. Who do you give it to?
The priests.
Give it to priests. Why?
Because they can't work for their money.
Who do they work for?
Well,
Technically,
for God.
God. They work for God. They don't own land, they don't own sheep, they don't own flocks, they don't own farms. They work for God. And they get a tenth of everything from 11 tribes. So they actually get paid a little more than everyone else, right, as the priests. Because they get a tenth, there's 11 tribes paying a tenth. That's an advantage. So, a tenth goes to the priest as a way to honor them. It's not less than everyone else, it's more than everyone else. That doesn't count that's just goes to the priest. That isn't the offerings, that's not the offering of first fruits, it's not the sacrifice for your sins. This is the salary for the priest. You're honoring them, right? It's how it's defined. Questions on that?
But timeline-wise, Melchizedek comes
Oh yeah, 800 years before that.
before
Yeah.
the, like, 12.
Oh yeah, long before.
Okay.
Yep, way before. Abraham,
So
timeline.
priests
Abraham,
before priests.
Isaac, Jacob, who turns into Israel. He has 12 sons.
And that's where priests get it.
This is the 12 tribes. When he has 12 tribes, they're not priests yet, right? They have to go, Joseph is one of those sons, they have to get into Egypt, then they have to get out of Egypt, get to Sinai, and then they get the law, and then they know. But when Moses writes this, in the same writings, 10% given to a priest is honor because they work for God. And Melchizedek, Abraham. Who's Abraham to a Jew? Important? Anyone bigger? You might argue Moses, but you might argue they're going to be equal. You're just not going to get bigger than Abraham. Is anyone going to be closer to God than Abraham? Well, again, you might try to argue Moses, but you're probably at best going to make him equal. Abraham's top shelf. Out of all the nations, he comes right after Tower of Babel. After all the nations, God chooses Abraham and makes a covenant with him to bless the whole world. Through your seed, Abraham, through your seed, I am going to create a nation for myself. You're the father of my people. Righteous by faith. So much faith that I declare you righteous. Moses didn't have that. God never says that to Moses. Abraham did. Abraham's a big deal. You can't get bigger than Abraham. What's he doing paying a tenth to someone else? Why wouldn't Abraham get a tenth from Melchizedek? Why in the world would Abraham, the top shelf, everyone else on the planet is pagans? What is Abraham doing paying a tenth, not receiving a tenth? The Jews couldn't figure it out. That makes Melchizedek huge. Abraham, this is the very words of Hebrews. The author is a Jew. We all know that the greater always is the one who blesses the lesser. And Melchizedek is the one who blessed Abraham. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, just by the story. Notice it says, Melchizedek came out and he blessed Abraham. Who gives blessings? Priests.
But he's both a priest and king,
So he's a riddle.
and the only priest and king.
Okay. So we'll get into all of this stuff because Melchizedek is a wrecker of the story. Like, you can't put him in there and not know where you're going, because it confused the Jews. We have their writings. It confused them. Who is this guy who's greater than Abraham? Let me ask you some questions. Well, let me just tell you stuff. Because you can't get it in English. It seems like Melchizedek is priest of who?
God Most High,
Who is that?
Yahweh.
You would think it's Yahweh, the God of the Bible. He's the king of Jerusalem, who's a priest to Yahweh. What would that tell you about the people in Jerusalem? They would be God's people, wouldn't they? He's their king and their priest. Well, what's God doing calling Abraham? Does God have two groups of people? Who is this guy? All right, so there's great debate over who Melchizedek is, right?
I believe he was like some believe he was the son of God appearing.
Yes, so some people say he's only a epiphany, it's called, there's an official name. An appearing of, like Jesus comes out.
Yeah.
Like an Old Testament, like the angel of the Lord. The word will come to me. So literally he is Christ. He shows up to Abraham, blesses Abraham, Abraham pays the tenth, and they're going to say he is Christ because he's the priest, and so he's not real. He's not really the
He
king.
doesn't have any genealogy, right?
That's what Hebrews is going to argue, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to argue from the language in Hebrews, and they're going to say, the problem is Salem is a real place. We have it archaeologically. We know, like, this is a settlement, and Abraham goes there, settles the place. When the Jews go in, they have to take it over. And the Jews, 400 years later, are told by God to kick all them out. They're horrible. That's not people, they're not like, oh, they used to be my people. So here's something. So, my mom used to hold, he is Christ. He has to be Christ. Like, this description doesn't fit anything. Hebrews calls it all a shadow, though. If it is Jesus, is that a shadow? Well, I don't know. The author of Hebrews says, like Melchizedek, like. You're not like yourself, right? If it is Jesus, then you're not like Jesus. Jesus is like Jesus. Hebrews then begins to get pretty confusing. If it is Jesus, then the author would, it doesn't make sense what Hebrews says, if it is, in my opinion. But they don't know what to do, so it is Jesus. The other option is, no, it is God's people. It's just going to go bad. So 400 years later, God calls Abraham, because Abraham's story isn't going to go bad, and this story is going to go bad, and so he just knows. And so God has two groups of people. That does not fit the story at all. Like, it just doesn't. Abraham is literally a pagan that God's going to work with, and it isn't going to go well with his people. The Jews don't do well. If God already has a king and priest in Jerusalem, and God chooses not to use them, and he calls a pagan, like, that's a problem. That's a giant problem. Here's what we know from all the archaeology we have now, which is very helpful. The main god in all of Canaan happens to be a god named El Elyon. We know it. It's a pagan god. He's El Elyon. He is God Most High. That's all that means. He's a priest of God Most High. So he's not a priest of a lesser god. So he's important. But he's a pagan priest to a fallen watcher, El Elyon, right? And notice subtly in the text, he blesses Abraham by El Elyon, the creator of heaven and earth. And then what does Abraham say? Abraham in verse 19 says, wrong page. So he blesses him by creator of El Elyon. Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. The king of Sodom said to Abraham, give me the people, keep the stuff yourself. But Abraham said to the king of Sodom with raised hand, I have sworn an oath to Yahweh El Elyon. Now I know he claims to be worshiping El Elyon, but he doesn't claim to be worshiping Yahweh El Elyon. Yahweh is the God Most High, right? So all the gods claim to be the God Most High, like everyone. Zeus is God Most High over the Roman pantheon. They all have an El Elyon. They do not all have a Yahweh, right? So I'm going to go with that view. I'm going to say Melchizedek is a priest to who cares, and he's pagan, right? He's a shadow. The ark is a shadow of our salvation. Is the ark important at all? Nope, it's a chunk of wood. It's just a chunk of wood. It's still a shadow. You don't have to be righteous to be a shadow. You just have to be a shadow. It doesn't really matter who you think he is, because that doesn't play into it at all. So I think he's pagan. I think he is a priest to El Elyon. Happens to be an important God, El Elyon. Abraham clarifies it, narrows it. No, Yahweh, El Elyon. So it's actually a battle text there. A distinguishing, like Jews, you are my people. I'm Yahweh, you're my people. Yes, Abraham follows Yahweh, not just El Elyon. Okay, let's get back to Melchizedek. So Melchizedek's this crazy character who Abraham comes across, and he's a riddle. He's a riddle because he's awesome, because Abraham pays him a tenth, and he's either a priest to God, which is a riddle in itself, or he's a priest to an idol, and yet Abraham still pays him a tenth. What's going on? What is going on? Who is this guy? And he's a king and priest. Where have we seen that before already in the story? Who else was a king and a priest? Adam. Adam is king and priest before the fall. Before the fall. Abraham, who's neither king or priest, meets a king and priest in Jerusalem, future Jerusalem, Salem, peace, and pays a tenth to him. This becomes the promised land. When Moses is writing, this is where they're trying to go. Jerusalem will literally become the Jewish capital. And God won't change its name, really. It's still the place of peace. It's still Salem. And God eventually is going to put a king priest on that throne. But when Moses gets the law, can Jews have a king priest? Cannot. When God makes the tribes, the 12 tribes, the priests come from the tribe of Levi, and the kings come from the tribe of Judah. They're separated. They can't go together. They're supposed to be together. Humans are created as king priests. We're to reign, rule and subdue, and to expand Eden over the whole earth. Both functions are given to Adam, right? We're king priests. Abraham recognizes the rightful station of that and pays a tenth. When God gives the Jews the law, they can't go back together. How is Abraham, if God doesn't want them to be together, why would he make them together here? And why would Abraham pay a tenth to somebody who's violating God's principles? I don't know. What? It's a riddle. It's a riddle. They can't figure it out. And then here comes David. Turn to Psalm 110. The only other place in the whole Old Testament where Melchizedek's talked about. And look how he has developed from those two verses to Psalm 110. Like, this is a absolutely massive psalm. Like, you just literally, this psalm is such a riddle to the Jews. Even Jesus uses this psalm. Here's what the psalm says. The Lord says to my Lord. Jesus throws that at the Pharisees. And he says, listen, who's the Messiah? They say, well, it's David's kid. And Jesus says, well, if it's David's kid, how is it that David is calling him Lord? Right? Because there's two lords right there. And who's talking to who? If it's David talking to the future Messiah, or if it's the Messiah rather, because you'll see, it is the Messiah who's speaking. If Messiah is Lord, how is it that, oh no, if David is Lord, how is he calling the Messiah Lord? So it has to be God. See, they can't make it God, because Yahweh calls someone else Lord? Like, they can't have that, right? So they have to reduce it. So now it's David first speaking, and David is the one blessing the Messiah. Well, if he's David's son, how can David call him Lord? And they go, and they won't. It says, and they wouldn't ask Jesus any more questions. Like, this is a huge deal. So someone, God, Yahweh, it's actually Yahweh, says to my Lord, who are the two lords? Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So Yahweh is saying to somebody, you sit and I will go work for you. Mind-boggling. Like they can't, okay? So the psalm itself is just setting up this crazy concept for the Jews, who this is their text, right? God's giving them a riddle. The Lord will extend your mighty scepter, king, right? That's king, scepter. Who has scepters? Kings. The Lord will extend your mighty scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your troops will be willing on your day of battle, arrayed in holy splendor. Your young men will come to you like dew from the morning's womb. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Wait, what? Who are you? When the Messiah comes, he's going to be a king and a priest. It's going to be both. It's going to be both. It's back here, and it's Melchizedek. And Adam's a riddle, but it's easy to go, yeah, but we were kicked out. We're lesser now. But if you throw Melchizedek in, and you make Abraham, who's the greatest possible person you could think of, and he honors Melchizedek. He says, you're greater than me. God tells the story so that Melchizedek blesses him, and then he pays a tenth. You're wrecked by it. As a Jew, you're wrecked by those concepts. Like, somehow we have to get back to a place. And then David rolls in 800 years later, and Melchizedek, Yahweh says to Adonai, Yahweh says to Adonai, my God says to my God, you sit down, you're a king, I want you to rule, and you're a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is now linked to Messiah. Indelibly, undeniably. How are they going to get the law? The law does not allow it. God does not allow priests and kings. It is literally why Saul got kicked out of being kingship. Saul, the first king. The straw that broke the camel's back is they're going to war. Eli, I believe it was, the high priest says, listen, is it Eli? I always get the priests wrong. Says to Abraham, like, go to war, get ready, do not go to war till I there and make a sacrifice. So Saul brings all the armies together, they're waiting. He's not coming, Saul says, I'll do it. Saul is the king, also functions as the priest. God says, that's it. Saul, you're cut off from king. You can no longer be king. You could have been king. I would have made a promise to your family for generations. And that boldness right there, or that disregard, is enough to banish you. God's spirit left, and God gave him an evil spirit the rest of his life. It's a big deal. Don't put these together. David comes and says, guess what? God's ultimate plan is to put them back together. But the law don't require it. Or the law doesn't allow it. Law don't allow it. So what does that mean? What has to happen? The law's got to go away. Somehow, the law must be changed. This can't stand. It can't stand. David, a long time, maybe another 800 years, a guy named Jeremiah shows up. And in Jeremiah 31, he writes, I am going to do something new. I'm going to write a new covenant. And the new covenant won't be like the old covenant. Because under the old covenant, I had to hold you accountable for your behavior. But I'm going to write a new covenant. And under the new covenant, I will no longer count your sin against you. God prophesies in Jeremiah, 800 years. So you have this, king and priest. Abraham gives him a tenth. You have David linking the Messiah to Melchizedek. And Messiah is going to be king and priest. The scepter won't leave. You sit down. You rule until that. And I swear you're also a priest. In the order of Melchizedek. King and priest. At Salem. Right? Like that. He doesn't have to be a good priest. Like Melchizedek. You're going to be like the ark. Right? It's okay to say that. The ark is just, you're not going to be wood. You're going to function the same idea, right? So he doesn't have to be righteous. He just has to be a shadow. And then that's the whole entire argument from the book of Hebrews. Now go to Hebrews. And every single piece. Now Hebrews is going to say a lot of cool stuff about Melchizedek. He's going to argue from silence, which we say, oh, you can't argue from silence. He's going to argue from silence. And what I mean by that is, the author of Hebrews, can I erase all this nonsense? The author of Hebrews is going to argue from silence. If you read, what's the hard part of reading Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? What's the hardest part when you're trying to make your way through it? Names. The genealogies, right? Why? Because everyone's given a genealogy. It's ridiculous. And he begot him, and he begot him, and he begot... And you're just stuck in there. You're like, why do I need to know all these names? Who was Melchizedek's father? You don't know. Now, are there other people in Genesis that you don't know their father? Yes, but not many. Not many. So, the author of Hebrews is going to say, without genealogy. And he's going to try to make a point. He's trying to tell us all the reasons why Melchizedek is great. Now, if you think the author of Hebrews is saying, he actually, the king Melchizedek himself, doesn't have a genealogy, then you have to make him Jesus. Right? Then you're stuck. He has to be Jesus. He's the only one. Right? He is forever. Right? He has to be God. God is without genealogy. Everyone else has one. If you go, listen, he's pretty unique in the book of Genesis. God made sure we didn't know his genealogy. Then he can be anybody. He can just be a name. And he is, so I'm gonna interpret it that way. He's arguing from silence. Look, the way the story's told, he's awesome. He shows up out of nowhere. And yet, he's greater than Abraham? It's a riddle. So I don't think he has to be Jesus. I think he just has to be a riddle. He's an intentional riddle. Right? So he's without genealogy. When did he die? How old did he live? That's the other thing. You know how old everyone was when they had a kid. You know how old almost everyone was who died. Certainly all the important people. Name an important person that you don't know how old they were when they died. You know them all. And yet, someone more important than Abraham, you don't know when he died? So, without beginning, without end, in the story. He's in the story. It's a novel. In the story, you have a mystery person who shows up without genealogy. You don't know where he began. You don't know how old he is. You don't know when he died. And yet, Abraham paid him a tenth. How does that character fit the story? Every single important person in the story, you know how old they were when they were born. You know who they're from. Because the story is a genealogy story. It's a genealogy story. So all the main characters, you know their story. Yet this is maybe the most important character because he's greater than Abraham. Yet we don't know when he began, when he died, who his parents were. Sounds like the Messiah. Right? Sounds like the Messiah. Sounds like he's a shadow. Sounds like he's pointing us somewhere important. Right? That's how I'm going to interpret Hebrews. Otherwise, you got to go, well, if those are actually true, then he has to be Jesus, which is fine. He can be Jesus. I'm okay with that too. If he's a shadow, if Jesus shows up as a shadow character, he still lays the same riddle down. Destiny is king priest together. That means the law, the entire 5 books of Moses, has to go away. So Moses, in the first couple pages of the first book he writes, tells you this. You can pretty much ignore everything else I'm going to write. Because everything else I'm going to write is destined to fail. Because we're getting to king priest somehow. And everything else I'm going to write is going to say no king priests. No king priests. No kings. When they get a king, is that a success story? No, it's a failure story. God's like, Samuel's like, oh, they're rejecting me. And God says, no, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. They don't want me anymore. They want a king. It's a failure story. But it's not a failure story. It's not a failure story. That's the destiny the whole time. We have to have a king to get to the Messiah, right? Jacob, when he blesses the 12 sons, before they even get into Egypt, before they even have the law, he blesses Judah and says, you will rule over your brother, and the scepter will not leave between your feet until the one who deserves to hold it comes. You will eventually have a king. They did it too soon. It wasn't wrong that they wanted it. It was just way out of order. I'm going to bet Messiah should have been the first king. Instead, he had to be the perfected king. But king, that's inevitable. And it's inevitable in the Melchizedek story. But that's why it's such a complicated, you have to know that to write Melchizedek into the story is to say, I know that everything else Moses is going to say has to go away. So now I have to tell a story where you guys are going to fail in completing this so that I am motivated to write a new covenant. And in the new covenant, I can't just break a covenant. That guy has to fulfill this covenant because it's an actual covenant, so it has to get fulfilled. But once it's fulfilled, I can write a new one. I'm even going to tell you what that new one is. And when the Messiah comes, who's going to shadow this, he'll be a king priest, and he will be God. The Lord says to my Lord, you're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. It will be God himself, and God himself will lose the law, fulfill the law for you, and then be your king and priest. He will be your high priest, and that's what the author of Hebrews does. He develops Jesus as our king. He develops Jesus as our high priest. The picture of Melchizedek gets fulfilled, and it's to put that in is to be saying all of that. Like you can't put someone in there more important than Abraham. Abraham gets us to Moses, who gets us to the law. The Jews are stuck in the law, right? They're stuck in the law. there isn't a single Jew that Jesus interacts with that goes, is it time for the new covenant? Is that what's happening? But Jeremiah, like, it's their text. Like, the author of Hebrews is gonna, so you can read all the Melchizedek stuff yourself. But
How does your Bible read 7:3?
7:3, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Yeah, like, or resembling.
That is like,
Yeah, yeah. So is he him, or does he resemble
He
him?
resembles him.
How does he?
I
Okay,
think he's a
so
harbinger like that.
correct. If it's a novel, then it's a character, and the character, you can just look at how all the important people have genealogies. This is the most important, doesn't have it. You can just say, I get it. Character development, that was ignored on purpose. It was ignored to teach us something. If you don't conceive it as a novel and its character, then you have to go, he has to be divine in some way, right? He has to be, because then it's a fact.
But it says he resembles.
But he resembles it. So does he resemble him or is he him? That's the trouble. If you make him the language of Hebrews is all resemblance or like, it never is. That was Jesus. He doesn't do that.
Oh, so he could still be, even though it says he resembles Jesus, he could still be Jesus? I mean, that's-
I'm going to go the other way, but very good Bible scholars go, he has to be Jesus, because they're going to take that as
See, I
actual
think that
and not
says he's
descriptive.
not.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I think he's saying descriptively he's like Jesus, not actually physically like Jesus. He's just descriptively like him. He's an important character without beginning, without end, without genealogy. That doesn't fit any important character, and yet he's clearly important. Why? Because he's a shadow of Jesus as a character. That's how I'm going to try to read that. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think it
What
does.
if he was a fallen launcher? Would that also be a possibility?
He could be anyone, but I don't think we have to do that. I think he's just human. I think he's the priest to a fallen watcher, El Elyon. So we know, without a shadow of a doubt. By the way, this isn't guesswork. We have tons of archaeological proof that the chief god in Canaan at that time was El Elyon, and it's a pagan god, and he's in the pantheon of the Canaanite gods, El Elyon. That's why I would say Abraham clarifies it. No, I worship Yahweh, who is El Elyon. Do they both want to be El Elyon? Yes, only one of them is. Abraham's going to say. So that's why Abraham doesn't come back with the same name. When we read it in English, you think it's the same name. No, he clarifies it with the personal name Yahweh. No, I worship Yahweh, El Elyon. They both claim to be El Elyon, God Most High. Only one is. Is it the chief god in Canaan, or is it Yahweh? So I'm going to say, I'm going to just be, it's a character in a good novel, a character development. If everyone is described a certain way, and now you have a key character who doesn't fit that mold, that's on purpose. It's on purpose, right? That's the missing information should draw your attention. Because every other main character, you know their birthdays, you know most of their hair color, for Pete's sake. And this one had red hair, he was ruddy. This one had, right? You know the redheads in this Melchizedek, who Abraham pays a tenth, you get none of it. Why? Why doesn't the author tell us that? Because he's a shadow. All that's going to be important. When this Messiah, who comes like him, is going to be Yahweh himself. Yahweh himself can't be like Melchizedek. If we knew his genealogy and that he died, that would break the symbolism, right? It would break it. So no, we're going to throw a main character in. I know, let's not give him a birthday. Let's not even give him a family line. Let's have him just appear out of nowhere and yet be the most important character on the planet. Oh, that'll point us to Jesus. Yeah, so that's how I think that goes. Bigger point, to write him in there, is to be saying, everything Moses writes is essentially already null and void. It's already null and void. Precisely what he's going to argue here in Hebrews. Listen, look, go to verse 18. And he's going to quote Psalm 8, let's go to 17. So he's going to quote Psalm 110. For it is declared, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. For that's it, and here's the argument he's making. How can Jesus be our priest? Like the law doesn't allow it. And here's what he says. The former regulation, the law, is set aside because it is weak and useless. The law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. And it is not without an oath. Others became priests without oath, but he became a priest with an oath. So he's making this huge sentence that is like a better hope. God in Melchizedek, in page 8, in page 8 of the story, put a better hope, a picture, a shadow of a better hope than every single thing Moses will write on Mount Sinai. This is no hope at all. How do you know? I'm telling you, before you even read it, before you even get to the laws in Deuteronomy, I'm going to tell you that there's a better hope coming. And it's in shadow form, but it's a real mind bender. And they're going to speculate their whole existence on who is this character where Abraham paid attention to. And if he's that important, why don't we know anything about him? Why does he show up out of the blue? And then David, Yahweh says to my Yahweh, Melchizedek? Like what? What? King, priest, Yahweh? Like, what is God saying? There's a better hope. Your hope is not in the law. And Jesus shows up as the Messiah. And where's their hope? In the law. It's in the law. And Jesus says, if you knew the law, he says this to the Pharisees, if you read the law, you have it memorized, you think that's enough. If you actually knew the law, you would believe in me. Because everything is in the law points to me. Who's the better hope? Who is this guy? That's all Jesus is saying. Read Moses and you'll find me. Because before he gave you the law, he told you a better hope is coming. That's greater than Abraham. Moses is less than Abraham because he's his son. Right? Moses could never bless Abraham, has to go the other way. That's what Jesus says to them. Like, how can he call him Lord? He's the son. Like, that's not how it works. So Abraham's downstream from Abraham, but Abraham pays attention to a mysterious character. So whatever Moses writes is less than Abraham. That's what Paul argues in Romans. How can the law trump faith? Abraham was saved by faith first. What's first is Moses is less than. The law that came 400 years later cannot trump faith. But what came before faith, or right there, a better hope. A better hope. And God introduces on page 8 the very hope that comes at the very end of the book. It's mind-bending. It's mind-bending. And he does it in a way that they know it's a riddle. They speculate and speculate and speculate. Who is this Melchizedek? We have their writings on it. We know they were bent, brain bent by it. And then David makes it worse for them. Like, now what are we going to do with this guy? Like, he just made him God. Like, what? He's not even Jewish. He's not even Jewish. How can we link the Messiah to a Gentile? Like, it's mind-bending. No, it's not. It's the same author writing a book, throwing an amazing shadow that gets you all the way to the Messiah. It makes the law have to go away. It's just beautiful. It's crazy. That's why he's only in 2 verses. If we had his story, He wouldn't work. You have to have a different guy. He has to show up. He has to be outside the covenant. And he has to be greater than Abraham. And that's who he is. It doesn't matter who he actually is. That's the character. And the character, Abraham pays attention to the character. I don't care who you think he is. It doesn't matter. Where he's leading us is still exactly the same, no matter who he is. If it's Jesus or a priest or a fictitious guy, it's a real guy. But isn't that cool? I think that's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. The book's a novel. Melchizedek is written precisely in the way that in the end, literally, I have this many pages to the end of the book. This guy has to explain who Melchizedek was in 10 different ways. Like, he's the picture of Jesus perfectly, right? And the point of it, that a better hope was introduced right here. Seed of a woman, a ridiculous salvation, a door in the side of a boat, righteousness by faith, and a better hope, not the law. By page 8. By page 8. It's crazy. It's crazy. And they're surprised that Jesus shows up because they don't know the story. They know a timeline. Learn it as a story, and it all makes way better sense. Does that make sense? Questions? It's cool, right?
It would be easy to miss. I mean,
Be easy to miss. It's 2 verses. Why even?
And then when you get to Hebrews, you go, I've heard that name before.
Right. Right. But as a Jew, the author of Hebrews is a Jew. He asked the question, why? Clearly, the author of Hebrews says, clearly, the greater blesses the lesser. Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and Abraham paid a tenth, and he argues, and he paid a tenth, and symbolically, that's like the priesthood paying a tenth to him because Levi was still in his groin, right, in his loins, right, still in his seed. He's in there, and so the priesthood bows knee, who we give a tenth to, they bowed knee in Abraham and gave it to Melchizedek. That's a Jewish person thinking through the story going, we see the picture, we're just confused by it. And he says, yeah, we've been confused for 2,000 years. Let me clear it up for you. He's the Messiah. He's Jesus. That's why Jesus shows up. That's why he's born of a virgin. That's what Paul's doing in that last verse. And he triumphed over them. He triumphed over them. He abolished their hold, he said. He abolished their hold by all the pieces. All the pieces. It's cloaked so that they would kill him. If it wasn't cloaked, they wouldn't kill him. Paul says that directly. It's cloaked so they'd kill him. They got tricked him. It's amazing. It's amazing. Okay. Yeah. Have a great day.